so much. I'm delighted to be here in recovery from having pushed the send button on a new book and trying to integrate it all. And so, for better or worse, I'm going to take you on my hills and vales through a journey that I've been very deep into the last couple of years, pulling together the themes of democracy and hunger. I really going to take you on a journey because I want to take you to where I began. I want to take you to 1968. That's a tattered version of Diet for a Small Planet. And I started out as a child of the 60s. I was a community organizer during the War on Poverty. And it was a time of great sense of possibility. And I went door to door organizing. And at some point, I said, wait a minute, am I really getting to root causes? So I better stop doing anything to try to save the world until I understand what the heck am I really going to the roots. And so I was terrified, but I pulled back and I waited for an intuition to come. And my intuition had to do with food, that food connects us all with each other. It connects us to the nurturing earth. It connects us to all of economics and politics. It connects us to our bodies very intimately every day, multiple times a day. If I could just understand why is there hunger in the world, that would get me to the roots. It would touch everything. And besides, everybody's interested in it. So what could be better for an entry point? So at the time, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, had just exploded. This was the late 60s. There was a book, much less known, called Famine 1975 that predicted, ongoing famine. So I thought, I'm going to figure this out. Is it really true that we're running out of food? Is it really true that we've hit the limits of the earth to feed us? And so I literally took my dad's slide rule and sat in the UC Berkeley library. And before the Google, before the internet, I had a very friendly librarian who took me from one stack to another stack. I put the numbers together. And I said, wait. There's more than enough food for all of us. There's more than enough food for all of us. And look what we're doing with it. We are shrinking it. We are creating scarcity out of plenty. And that was the beginning, in a sense, of my journey that brought me here tonight. Very much that question, that realization that said, wait, how could a bright species that we are be actually shrinking our food supply and then claiming that there wasn't enough for us? And some of you might, not many of you would remember, but may have heard of Garrett Hardin, who wrote the Lifeboat Ethic that said, it's too late. We're running out, so some people are just going to have to starve. I mean, that's where we were. This is the late 60s. So I thought, what do I do with this? That we're actually creating scarcity out of plenty. If I could just explain that to people, that we could begin to make sense of this food system and create one that actually was meeting human needs. But I just want to point out a few things as I get into where just a few factual things. Okay, this scarcity claim is still today. Lester Brown, for example, has said recently, scarcity is the new norm. He's a food analyst that's highly regarded. Scarcity is the new norm, and yet, in fact, there is 40% more food produced today per capita than when I was sitting on that log. And look at this this reality of food abundance today. That for every human being on Earth, think how many, if you ate 2,900 calories a day, I mean, we probably couldn't fit in here too well. I mean, that's a lot of food. 3 to 4 pounds of food. And so what I'm saying is that this reality of abundance is even more true today than it was then. And I want to make clear that 2,900 calories, that is just on the leftovers. That's the leftovers. After we feed about half of all grain, not to people, but mainly to livestock, and then some of it goes for industrial purposes, including fuel now. And of all calories, about a quarter of all calories wasted. So that's the big picture that started back then, and that's what the reality is today. So at the very same time, what has happened to the hunger picture? What has happened to, oh, I forgot about this slide. This, I think, kind of sums up something of the inefficiency of what we've created. Think about that. 3/4 of all of Earth's agricultural resources, crop and pasture land, go to livestock that return to us about 16% of the world's calories. That gives you some sense of the magnitude of the built-in. I said 1/4 of all calories are wasted. Well, that's not even counting that kind of waste, the built-in waste, this incredibly inefficient system. So, what is this then? How does it look? What's happened to hunger since I began this journey? Well, it's very interesting, and it really, we had to really dig in for this new book about world hunger, because the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, measures hunger by lack of calories, severe lack of calories, enduring longer than a year. If you're hungry for 9 months, if you're hungry during the hungry season, very hungry, it doesn't count. You have to be hungry for more than a year, and you have to be calorie deficient, seriously calorie deficient for more than a year. And so we started looking at these numbers, and today the UN FAO reports 805 million people fit that definition of hunger. But we began to wonder whether that is really the best way to think about measuring the challenge of food suffering in the world today. And so we, in our new book, we really take on the FAO's frame. And we say, first of all, just in terms of calories, let me just point out that if you look at the UN documents and the press coverage based on this calorie count that comes up with 805 million people, you'll learn that this is great news because we've greatly reduced the number of hungry people in the world, the share of hungry people in the world. Great. What is typically not mentioned is that without progress in China since 1990, without progress in China, in the developing world, there would have been about 7% decline in the number of hungry people. And a lot of that progress in China took place in the 1990s. So, but there's another problem with celebrating that this 805, first of all, it's a lot in itself, but there's another problem here. And that is that many of us are aware that the quality of our food is degrading, so that calories become less and less a good measure of hunger. I met a doctor in India not long ago, in Andhra Pradesh, India, in southern India. He's been treating 2,000 patients, rural Indians, poor people, for quite some time. He said it's changed dramatically. Today, he said, most of my patients have plenty of calories, or have enough calories, but 60% of them are diabetic and have heart conditions. The quality of their food, they're surviving on white polished rice, and I would imagine a lot of soda because the water is impure and soda is inexpensive. And you can imagine what that does to your health. And so we challenge and say, wait a minute, we need another way to think about hunger. And so we're offering what we think is a more meaningful measure of hunger. We're asking to consider that more accurate is to look at the percentage of people who are stunted. We think of stunting as something that's just about childhood because that's when it is measured. But actually stunting has lifelong consequences. Cognitive impairment and for in childbirth, in mothering, in giving birth, stunting as an adult affects the outcomes in life for women. So we're suggesting that if you think of stunting is caused by lack of proper nutrients, it's not just a calorie measure, it's lack of proper nutrients and many other issues, including unsanitary water. That means you have an infection so that you can't absorb the nutrients in your body. So we're suggesting that a better proxy for the state of what we call nutritional deprivation in the world is really this 1 in 4 in the world. And if that were the case, then it would be not 800 million people, but about 1.8 billion people who are nutritionally deprived in the world. And actually, this slide was created before we worked all this out for our book. But you get the idea of where we're headed, that we really need a conversation about the quality of food. And I highly recommend a new article in Lancet that first time looked globally at if you're curious about going deeper into this question of do calories really measure hunger today. That's a very good article I could lead you to if you can't find it easily. So that's where, you know, the title of my talk, Fat, Famine, and Fruit Loops, well, this is where the Fruit Loops come in, and also the fat, because we can be obese, as many of us know, in this country, but also in the global south, because you're eating plenty more calories than your body can use, and you're not getting the nutrients that you need. And we know that that obesity is a risk factor for many diseases that are very, very serious. And most of the most of the obesity in the world now is in the global south. So this is something of the picture that emerges from this journey since that log to where we are now, where there is actually more food produced per person, dramatically more, and yet we are suffering the severe nutritional deprivation we claim is the way we're talking about it. We think it's more meaningful to talk about 1 in 4 in the world today. So, okay. My question, though, kept growing. You see, I was sitting there thinking, oh, the question is, have we hit the Earth's limits? And my question kept growing and growing until finally it came to this one. This question became the leading question of my life during the 1990s. And I was taught by many great thinkers to see that there was only one thing powerful enough to have this brilliant species be creating a world together that we as individuals would never choose. Because not one of us would want a child to go to bed hungry, and yet another thing we calculated for our book is that the child death rate from hunger is equivalent to a Hiroshima bomb going off every 8 days. No one would choose that. So why are we together choosing that which, as individuals, we abhor, that violates our most basic sensibilities? What could be powerful enough? And over time, I came to believe that there is only one thing so powerful to have us creating a world that none of us would choose individually. And it is the power of ideas. And I know that sounds very anticlimactic, and I want to tell you a very homey tale to bring it to life for you. Several Thanksgivings ago, I was running down into the kitchen to look for in the morning of Thanksgiving, because 35 people were coming in the afternoon, and I wanted to make my favorite root vegetable dish. And I looked for my Dutch oven, and I knew where it was, and it wasn't there. I was so annoyed. And I kept looking the basement everywhere. I couldn't find it. I finally gave up, went on doing something else. And then I turned around about an hour later, and guess what? There it was, except that it had a planter in it. It had a plant in it. So you get my point. I was looking for a baking item, but because it had a plant in it, I didn't see it. So I'm suggesting that the power of ideas is that we keep looking in the wrong places, and we can't see solutions that are right in front of our nose because they don't fit the middle frames which we're peering through. And so the challenge of my life has been to, how do I name? What is it that these blinders that we wear, what is it that can alienate us from our common sense? And over time, I've tried to summarize it very simply, and I got it down to the 3 S's. I got it down to the 3 S's. And I'm suggesting that we have inherited a worldview, especially strong in this culture, which teaches us in many, many ways, it's the invisible ether, that we are all separate from one another and from nature, that things are relatively static. He's good or bad, you know, he is, you know, nothing I can do to change that. Those evil people over there in ISIS, they're bad, obviously, that's fixed. And our economy, it is what it is. The market works as it does, it is what it is, can't change that. So it's a notion of stasis, and the third piece of it is that there is not enough of anything. There's not enough goodness in us, and there's not enough parking places in New York City, there's not enough love, you name it. There's not enough of anything. Energy, food, whatever. So the three S's, this frame of scarcity, the separation, stasis, blocks us from seeing what is clearly right there, the incredible abundance of the world and the solutions that abound and are growing. So that's really the challenging question. And we end up then creating the very conditions, and this I'm going to try to do very quickly here, but we end up creating then out of that sense of scarcity and sense of separateness to one another, we turn over our fate to automatic mechanisms such as the market, which we're told works on its own, and we end up in sort of a giant game of monopoly, as I think of it, in which we end up in this extreme concentration of wealth that is almost even hard to get your head around. 85 people controlling as much wealth as the bottom half income holders in the world. So we end up, from this frame of scarcity, creating, my hypothesis is, exactly the conditions that have been shown to bring out the very worst in our species. We end up with these system characteristics of concentrating power, lack of transparency, that is, we know that we don't do well when things aren't transparent. In fact, I love to tell this story. I read about an experiment that was done in a university where the faculty were not paying for their coffee at the honor system coffee station. And so a psychology professor put a picture of a pair of human eyes above the coffee station, and guess what? The professors started paying for their coffee. But we know we don't do well, as we saw on Wall Street when they, you know, the slogan on Wall Street during the dark days of the dicing and slicing of these risky derivatives that they were selling to us as legitimate? The slogan was IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone, meaning we'll be out of here. It's secret. They won't catch us. So we don't do well. And blame. The idea that it's just Wall Street, it's not me, even though, of course, where was I when that deregulation happened? You know, where were we as citizens? Were we doing our job? So this blame game, those three characteristics in my hypothesis is what follows from this scarcity frame. And we end up then saying, okay, then we end up basically creating the death knell for democracy. We end up, and this is one of my favorite quotes of an American president. I thought it was one of the braver. He simply says, the liberty of democracy is not safe if a people tolerate the growth of private power it is stronger than the democratic state itself. And he actually uses the F word, which I have not had the courage to use except in quoting an American president. But there it is. So we end up with these conditions then, private power over the public, that bring out the very worst in us, and then we say, see, we really are these little selfish, separate, competitive creatures, and there it is. There's not much we can do. We end up with what I love to call privately held government. It should be an oxymoron. So trapped in the scarcity mind, I realize this is very, very condensed, but trapped in the scarcity mind, we end up then creating the very conditions that are the death knell of democracy and bring out the very worst in our species. Now, here we are. Is it possible? We see this is not working, right? We should have learned during the 20th century that totalitarianism didn't work, authoritarianism didn't work. Now we're seeing that this notion of a simplistic formula does not work, that we can just turn over our fate to a concentrated market. It does not work. We could be in that moment of dissonance in which there's a lot of rethinking that we can do, and that we can actually challenge some of the assumptions of the scarcity mind, this idea of separateness and stasis, and we can actually see, if we let the jarring of our brains, let some air, some light in, some new thoughts in, that we can shift then to what I think is a much more evidence-based way of seeing, one increasingly documented across the disciplines. And so it is something that I think makes the way for real, what I call living democracy, as you now know. And so it, to me, offers this possibility that we can move from the S's to the C's. We can move from this sense of separateness to connection, to realization that the nature of life is continuous change, and from the notion of not enoughness to the possibility of co-creation, if we align with the laws of nature, of course. And this is an enormous shift that, as I say, is in now virtually every, I highly recommend a book called The Systems Way of Life, Fritjof Capra's new book about systems thinking, where he brings in multiple disciplines. And I was also struck years ago by the now late Hans-Peter Dürr, the physicist in Germany, who, describing this in his own words, he said, Frankie, in a biological system, there are no parts, there are only participants. And if we begin then to look at life through this eco-mind, I like to call it, we begin to see that we aren't stuck. That is the foundational idea here. And it begins then to make possible what I think of as living democracy, which is at its essence, in some ways to me, about voice and dignity. That if, when I saw people going hungry amidst plenty, and I still do today, even greater plenty, I realized that no one willingly goes hungry. If somebody's going hungry, then they have been denied a voice in their circumstance. The promise of democracy has been belied. And the essence of having voice and being heard is that sense of being having dignity in community. So before I go, though, to into more deeply into what I mean by living democracy, I want to offer just a reminder of a little more hard-nosed way of arguing this point, because it can sound very nice. But I also want to suggest that it is also very evidence-based way of thinking about who we are as a species, and it's often quite different than one kind of picks up, I think, in our culture. And what I mean is that if we look at what we learned about ourselves from the Holocaust, for example, and really read the history, we realize that that was not a horror created by a few madmen. No, there were millions of regular people killing others point blank. You know, I mean, really cold-blooded murder. If we look at how we behave, say, how many of you studied the Stanford prison experiments? Well, if you haven't heard of them, you might read The Lucifer Effect by the professor of psychology, Philip Zimbardo. When I was writing Diet for a Small Planet, he was in his basement library, basement psychology lab, carrying out an experiment in which he took young people who tested normal, and he put them in different roles, the guards in the jail, this mock jail, and the prisoners. And within days, they were brutalizing each other so badly, he said later, that it reminded him of those images of Abu Ghraib. And his girlfriend had to convince him to stop the experiment because he was becoming the warden, not even thinking about the mental health of his students. And one young person had a breakdown, and they did have to stop the experiment after 6 days. So we know, and then of course the Milgram experiments, we know that in the right, that is wrong conditions, that not just the bad guys, but virtually any of us can behave with incredible cruelty. So if we really let that sink in, we can stop the blame game and we can just say, okay, what are the conditions that bring out the best in us and keep the worst in check? And look very, very soberly at those answers. And so back to this, my hypothesis, and you have plenty of time to challenge me after this. You can challenge that, but I think that at least these three conditions, and then we know what to do, because the opposite of those then has a chance to bring out the very best in us. And to accept then that the good, bad, and the ugly is in each. And what are the conditions that bring out the best? That is the challenge of our species. And there's a lot of evidence, I think, to suggest that these qualities bring out the better sides of our nature. So we don't have to worry about some kind of spiritual transformation of humanity. Isn't that a big relief? We're okay. We're good enough. We are good enough now if we do this good work, which I'm about to get to. So that then makes possible, these are the system characteristics then of what I call living democracy. Democracy not as an inherited structure that we were lucky enough to sort of be born into, but an evolving culture. As William Hastie, one of the early African American judges, said, democracy is not being, it is becoming. It is easily lost, but never finally won. Its essence is eternal struggle. And I used to drop that last line because I thought it was too much. But you know what? It is good struggle. And that's what I want to leave you with tonight. It is a struggle that stirs the soul. And it is not, it is the struggle of our time. So I'm suggesting then that these are the system characteristics of what I call living democracy. It understands, this is also put forth, that this is not living democracy. In my view, it's not the spinach we eat in order that we can have our dessert of private life and our private joys, but actually living and contributing and being a co-creator of a living democracy meets the deepest of human needs. And I would go so far as to say that living democracy then meets these very deep human needs for connection, meaning, and power. Power understood in its Latin root, to be able. Our capacity to act, to make a dent, as Erich Fromm put it, are the deep, deep human need to make a difference in the world. And so what I'm suggesting is that right now, we are alive at a time when two extraordinary things are happening at once. You know, people often say to me, especially now that I'm old lady, they say, well, do you think, since you were young, that things have gotten better or worse? And of course, I have to say both, because we are living in this most incredible time of the most extraordinarily positive changes underway, and yet so many losses here, even in my own country, that I can't imagine that I would ever see. So much setback in terms of where democracy, I thought, was headed. And so we are moving very much in two directions at once. Can democracy as a living practice, not what we have, but what we do, a rewarding culture that meets our need for connection, meaning, and agency, can that emerge? Is that emerging? And so I want to get into some particular examples that move me today very deeply, but before I do that, I just want to point out that in the ether of our culture, that there are two strong strains, both on right and left, that I feel are very anti-democratic, in the sense of certainly the most obvious is corporatism, but philosophically, the libertarian strain that says that government is necessarily inept and corrupt. But even among my buddies, there is a strong strain of, oh, corporate power has such a tight grip on our democracy, that all we can do is do the right thing ourselves and shop local and join a CSA and on and on. You know what I'm talking about. And I think both are really unnecessarily unnecessary and don't get us where we need to go. So what I'm suggesting then is that we begin to incorporate the idea of democracy as a living practice in part by making a point of getting familiar with examples of it. And this is what I've been, I will just tell you a couple stories and then go back to what living democracy requires of us personally, I think. And I know that you're an urban, but my my life has been pretty much focused on rural, and so I just want to take you to India. I want to take you to India for a moment because think about India. India is the world's largest so-called democracy, right? It's got all the trappings. It's got multiple parties. It's got elections. It's got a constitution. And yet, India is home to more hungry people than any other in the world. About a quarter of all the hungry people live there. So I want to take you to rural India, where I had the pleasure of traveling and meeting women who represent to me everything, in a sense, I'm talking about with living democracy. And so it's going to get very real, I hope. These are women about 3 hours from Hyderabad who, a few decades ago, they told me their life was so dark. They were humiliated by the landlord, beaten by their husbands. They were constantly hungry. They just could do a little bit of work for the landlord and get a little bit of grain to feed their children, and that was it. Always on the edge of famine. They had one sari to wear, they told me. They couldn't even bathe properly. They had to wash part of their clothing and then let that dry to wash the other part because they only had one. And when I met them, they had transformed that in a couple of decades. They had, with a very little upfront revolving loan, they were able to plant land that had lain fallow in a biodiverse way, where they had been dependent on this polished white rice that I pointed was connected to the diabetes. They then were growing dozens of crops in the 1 acre. I walked into their fields, and multiple millets and greens and oil seeds, and it was an amazing thing that I saw. And I said, "How did you do this? How did you do this?" And they said, the farmers of the Deccan Development Society, they told me that they just started talking to one another, making the commitment to meet once a week, 9 o'clock at night after the kids were in bed. They'd gather in their sangams and they'd make plans together. And they would share their knowledge of how to grow ecologically. And they would share, they bought, for example, a millet processing machine together. They created ultimately a cooperative market. They even have their own radio program now. But I want to point you to this image here. What are they doing there? They're holding their hands out in a ceremony, in a ritual, in which they pledge to one another 3 things. They pledge to not use chemicals, because everybody in the village is affected, not just the individual. Not to use genetically modified seeds, and to share their knowledge. So they make a public commitment, and that seemed foundational to the success of this organization. Now they have spread so far, and just last month, as they do every year in February, they go village to village teaching seed saving and sharing. So it's a share concept. They also have organized to change the rules of their governance so that they've convinced the state government not just to procure the polished white rice that's not very healthy, that for the public distribution system, the subsidized rice, some of you may know in India, but to procure these much healthier much healthier millets as well from the small farmers. So they've stepped up through a letter writing campaign and through their own conversations with the decision makers and convinced them to change the policy, which can have huge consequences because half the women in India are anemic. And millet has about, this kind of millet they're growing has about 10 times more iron than the rice that they had been living on before. So the women of the Deccan Development Society, I want to point out also, they are members of what has been the lowest caste, the untouchables in India, and now they are, there they are. I took that photo, but I know it's not the greatest photo in the world, but look at their faces. Look at the joy, the dignity, the power. And I have to say, when we were sitting on the floor, and they were telling me about what they were doing, a young man brought us tea. And they told me now that if there's any abuse of a woman in the village, all the women go and confront the abuser. And so there's much more respect among the men for the women. So the Deccan Development Society then is part of a wider movement in Andhra Pradesh that is now supported by the state government, where the state is helping to develop what they call village activists and cluster activist teachers, each one train one for the movement to agroecology. And it's a very rich system in which the people themselves have to commit to a certain amount of, it's a mutual commitment, not a one-way. So it fills that my system element of a mutual accountability, not just a one-way system. And this wider movement in Andhra Pradesh is reaching hundreds of thousands. I want to jump from there to another part of the world. I want to jump to Africa, because here again, in a very, very different area of the world, extremely poor farmers who I understand, they would go for half a year without any food security at all, but what they call the lean season, and you could see how degraded the land was. And through a very deep process of creating village councils in which people made commitments to one another about what they would do to help to restore this land, including removing livestock from some of the land, but also literally, publicly, in their meetings, which they had once a month, they created bylaws. They also then each committed publicly to what is the work that they would contribute to the commons, because this is a huge amount of creating small dams to prevent the erosion and creating terraces so that the water would not erode the hillsides. And over about a decade, they were able to increase yields by about 80%, and 86% of the 700,000 farmers in the area were adopting these ecological practices. And in fact, I can't put this in writing, but I can say this, that because I haven't fact-checked it, but a very knowledgeable person told me that he believed that in this process, behind these pictures, that the Ethiopians in Tigray moved more rock than the Egyptians moved to create the pyramids. So I don't know if it's true, but it impressed me. Anyway, so you see the combination of this very clear process and meeting people's need for connection with one another, their sense of agency and the sense of meaning and the transformation of the lives, of their own lives. And similarly, this is happening in the Sahel. I do want to jump now to the state level as well. And I know when I talk about Brazil, I was a little bit nervous with Professor Bianchi in the audience at Coles to Newcastle and all of that. But actually, the last time I saw you was in Porto Alegre, right? For this World Social Forum. But one could not talk about state action as it relates to food without talking about Brazil. And without talking about the elements of living democracy the last time I was with Sao Paulo, it was right after President Lula had been elected. And I still remember at that time, standing on a hillside, it was one of the first speeches that he gave after he was elected. It was in early 2003. And there were T-shirts that said in Portuguese, but it was translated for me, "Make like Lula, participate. This is a story we are creating together." And so the whole sense that one got, I know that nothing is ever simple, but that the social movements that led to the capacity for a workers' party to be created and then to elect someone in 2002, the person who became known as Lula, someone who had been a metal worker, to office on the platform, really, of working to end hunger. And out of that came what is known as Zero Fome, which zero hunger, Fome Zero, excuse me. And this is how it's translated for us. I don't know if that's a good translation, but Brazilians who have enough to eat, helping those who don't. Somehow that got, you have to tell me if that's a decent translation of what the slogan was. But I know of no other country in the world that has so thoroughly tackled this. I think they think about this program of zero hunger as in 31 different dimensions that includes one of the most successful, what is called a conditional cash transfer. That simply saying, if you keep your kids in school and if you get them vaccinated, then you will get 90% of these cash transfers go to women, and you will get, came out to $30-something average, but it's such an interesting approach of this just across the board simple cash transfer to the poorest, and that is a big reason why in less than a decade that Brazil could claim that its official poverty rate had been cut by 40% in less than 10 years. And interestingly, here we have the idea if somebody gets a cash transfer as an anti-poverty initiative, oh, that's going to make them lazy, right? That's what we hear. And yet, study done said that women actually have a 16% higher participation rate in paid employment who are recipients of this Bolsa Família, is what it's called in Portuguese, or family payment. So this then is one of the strategies, but the approaches come out of, I understand it, a council that was created with a lot of input by civil society groups and by the ministries working together to come up with a whole range of programs. And my daughter and I had this great opportunity to visit a city that is one of the leaders in the right to food movement. Belo Horizonte is close as I can get to the pronunciation, beautiful horizon. And we were so struck by what this kind of multi-faceted advisory council came up with in terms of kinds of initiatives that are so commonsensical that in 12 years helped to cut the the child death rate by 72%. I mean, it's enormous impact. I mean, that's got to be his, speed record in terms of social change. But things like, really simple things, like when we walked around in the inner city, the city allowed small farmers to use small plots of land in the inner city near poor people to sell their produce if they would keep it at a price the poor could afford. And it was great for the farmers because they got such a, they had so many more customers that even though they kept their prices low, they loved it. They did really well. And they also, grocery stores, they made deals with several dozen grocery stores that if they would keep their price of 20 to 25 basic food items within the reach of the poor, then they could sell the rest for whatever they wanted, and they would get a special deal for the rent from the city. Very commonsensical. And they created several what they call popular restaurants or people's restaurants. And they're so different from how you imagine a soup kitchen feeling. big open air, and when we went in, there was no sense of shame or embarrassment about being there. There were young military guys who were trying to save money so that they could buy a house because they wanted to get married. Or one told us that. There was an elderly gentleman who took the bus ride there every day because he wanted the company, the companionship, and there was moms with their kids there. So it was a sense, and it wasn't free. You still had to pay for it, but it was a fraction of what you would pay if you were paying market price. And really simple things also, like at bus stops and on the radio, they posted the price where you could get the cheapest of these basic food commodities. So there was a downward pressure against gouging of poor people, which we know happens a lot here, right? So these, you get the idea that they were just, and their school gardens and participatory budgeting was a huge, which is a whole other story that there are a lot of experts in the audience on, or at least one very distinguished one. But the idea of people coming together and choosing how to use a percentage of the city budget. And you've got to fact check me on this, but I read for our new book that something like 1,000 separate projects have been carried out in Belo Horizonte because of this participatory process, an iterative process where citizens have more direct say over a portion of a city budget. So I'm just including Brazil here, an example, not in any perfect form by any means, but there are now 24 countries in the world that in their constitutions they guarantee a right to eat. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean a lot unless you have active citizens engaged in this participatory or living democracy. And so this is the kind of thing that can actually turn such a right on paper into reality in people's lives. It's such a stunning consequence in terms of reducing child death, which is one measure of hunger in such a short period of time. It's happened in Belo Horizonte. But I want now to move to the final part of my talk, which is much more personal. And if it's true that we are in this moment of moving in two directions at once, and how do we keep from spinning? What is required of us? What is the essence of what is required to be really feel like you're using your time here as best you can? What do I tell myself? I'm just really speaking very much to myself here, but I'll tell you what I'm trying to work on. And that is a quality that I've come to call bold humility. And I want to stick with the bold part for most of what I'm going to say here. Because here is what I see the human challenge is. I remember I said we're good enough. Well, I really believe that we have such a profoundly social nature. We're the most social species, and it has a double edge. We are so social that we love to fit in, that we love to go along with what is if it means that we're accepted in a group. But you and I are alive at this time where the tribe is heading over the falls. Yeah. So if the tribe is heading in the wrong direction and we're alive in such a time, we've got to really be watching that social nature of ours that tells us just to go with the pack. And I think have to be listening then. What does it mean then to develop the boldness, the courage to check that part of our social nature and to say, you know what? I know that breaking with the pack is going to bring up a lot of anxiety and fear, and I'm going to figure out a way to do it. I'm going to figure out a way to think of energy, of fear as energy, not as a stop sign, but as energy to take me. And I'm going to see what could happen with that reframe. And so my suggestion is that I'm going to go on about that for a minute, but I think what is it that makes people fearless? And one of them is love. Love, we do all sorts of crazy things for love, right? We take enormous risks. We persist with love. We make sacrifices for love. What if we fell in love with democracy? I know it sounds crazy, but what if we fell in love with democracy? You know, what is democracy but an art? It is an art that we learn like any other art. And why do we do an art? You know, it's tedious. It's sometimes, really drudgery. And yet sometimes it's incredibly exciting. And we do it because we think it's beautiful, because we think that we're creating something of beauty. What if we thought about democracy as something that is a set of arts that we can learn like any other art, and we can see as a thing of beauty? And so we tolerate the drudgery part. And when I say an art, what do I mean? I mean the art of listening, the art of walking with fear, as those women in rural India did, standing up together. It means working through direction together. It means negotiating conflict and seeing conflict as often creative, and all of those things I consider the art of democracy. So I think that's part of it. I'm not, and it's so hard in this culture where we're told that democracy is a yawn, right? Boring civics. And so what can make it possible for us to fall in love with democracy? I think from this reframe I'm asking us to do, from this separateness, remember the 3 S's of separateness and stasis and scarcity, to the frame of eco-mind, of connection, change, and co-creation, that the simple answer is who we bring into our lives, who we connect with. Clearly you've chosen to be here because there is this theme of what is democracy and how do we create it. And so who do we bring into our lives that reinforce? Because we know that we are so connected that we will reflect who we bring into our lives. And if we want to be more risk-taking, then we bring risk-takers into our lives, and we hold them very close in our heart. And so I want to, on that theme, just mention someone. Sorry, I forgot I had these slides. So carried away with anyway, this is what I've been talking about, right? Rethinking fear and power. Sorry. I want to take you to Wangari Maathai, because I think that it's really important if we're to make this change that we hold people close to us who can be our lodestar of courage, if you will. And for me, Wangari is that. We lost her a few years ago, but she is still in me. I met her in the year 2000, and she had planted 7 trees on Earth Day in 1977. And she was laughed at by the foresters when she said that planting trees could be an important task of village women and that could help reverse the encroaching desert. And they literally laughed. And she stood up to the then dictator, and she was thrown in prison and beaten. She walked with her fear. And when we visited her in the year 2000, Village Women had already planted about 20 million trees through the Greenbelt movement that she founded, starting with those 7. And then, after she got the Nobel Prize in 2004, she teamed up with the UN Environmental Program to start Plant for the Planet, and now that program has planted 12 billion trees around the world. So from 7 to 12 billion. But what I'm saying about Wangari is that she said to us, she said, planting trees isn't the most important part of it. The most important part of what we do is what we call civic education. And she had a workshop that I thought was brilliant. She called it the wrong bus syndrome, was the workshop that she did. And she'd ask these villagers, like, what would you do if you were on the wrong bus? If somebody had misled you and encouraged you to get on the wrong bus, and maybe you didn't understand the language, you were confused, maybe somebody was trying to trick you, but in any case, you were on the wrong bus. If you don't get up and get off, you could end up way far away from home. So how can you make that decision to just, again, walk in a new way. So Wangari then became my touchstone and my lodestar, if you will, for this understanding that we are in such a time where the old frame is not working, where the evidence of so many different disciplines is converging on this other way of seeing life in connection and continuous change. And at the same time, there are these powerful, powerful examples that are still not known to most people of how living democracies can work in urban settings, in rural settings, and at the state level. So I think that we are at a time then where these choices are ours to make. We can be, I jumped over, let me go back to it, because in our own country, there's a very practical step that we can take now, that we don't have to wait for a constitutional amendment to reclaim our electoral democracy. This is a series, this strategy is a series of steps to move us toward citizen-funded elections instead of big money-funded elections, which is a critical piece of reclaiming our electoral democracy. And just to underscore, before I finally wrap up, to underscore that electoral democracy can make a difference in food and hunger, I just was reading, I highly recommend if you don't know it, a report on electoral integrity of electoral, rankings of electoral integrity of electoral systems. And it was so interesting to look at those at the very top, ranked by 1,400 experts on electoral integrity, and meaning how much are they influenced by money. That those at the top, you're not going to be surprised, were Norway, Sweden, Germany, and Netherlands. I compared those with, in terms of hunger, I used, as a proxy for hunger, I used infant mortality. And today, those countries at the top of the electoral integrity charts have half the infant death rate that we do in the United States, and we rank down next to Mexico on that list. So clearly there are very practical things that we can do, and I hope that in this talk I've shared with you something of this journey that I'm taking to pull these threads together, and that to me the most useful thing about this frame that I'm trying to develop and share is that it leads us to this realization that if indeed this connection, continuous change, and co-creation, then what? It's not possible to know what's possible. So there's a freedom in it, because if change is the nature of life, then it is truly not possible to know. And therefore we are free to trust our deepest sensibilities, to walk with our fear of change, and to do the wonderful work that you are doing here at the center. And thank you for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Yeah, I'm eager for your questions.
Hi, hello. So, I'm not sure how similar the terminology is, but between the way that you've spoken about these issues and the ideologies that sort of control the way in which we live. Daniel Quinn suggests that the three C's, the three S's that you identified stem from agriculture in itself, and seeing how the solutions you proposed and used as examples, whether or not they were complete, were involving agriculture. And so I'm wondering about how intrinsic you see agriculture to be with the three S's.
Well, I do. Did you hear the question? Just, well, clearly, our industrial agricultural system is an embodiment of the three S's, this drive, this just production, 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 without seeing the connectedness of all of the impacts. And this is what we try to draw out in our new book. So I think that this transformation at an agricultural level is a key for so much of the rethinking going on, because of course to grow food healthfully we have to totally re-understand what soil is, that it's not just something to hold up to, this inert thing that holds up. It's a living community. And on that note, speaking of hope, I have to say, in the role of agriculture, what I ended up doing in the chapter on ecological agriculture in this book? Throughout the chapter, I quoted the United States Department of Agriculture, because there are folks in the USDA that get it and are teaching. And there was an article in the Science Times and the New York Times supplement, on Tuesdays, about no-till farming and other green manures and approaches that we associate with alternative agriculture that are being taught by the United States Department of Agriculture. So I just can't quite believe it, but I just kept quoting from USDA to show that this approach is in fact spreading, is legitimizing through at the same time, of course, as we have our government supporting genetically modified organisms and the biggest agrochemical companies. So it's part of the contradiction, but I think agriculture is an extremely important part of this shift that we are making and must make.
Thank you for the presentation. I think your outline is spot on in terms of what some of the, I guess you can say, flaws have been in the pathways we need to travel in order to get to some place where we're more eco-minded. I'll explain this a bit better, but the dopey version of my question is, how do we get the rest of the world to think like you?
How do what?
How do we get the whole rest of the world to think like you? I ask this because I'm actually going to present at a conference next month in Geneva about interdisciplinary education, and trying to sort of bring back versions of a noted Brazilian, Paulo Freire, in terms of pedagogy of the oppressed. And the idea, one of the ideas at least, is that if we try to combine aspects of the disciplines, say English literature and say economics, to use one to understand the other better or more thoroughly, that maybe students can start to come to these sorts of conclusions and realizations and more interesting sorts of creating the world on their own. So how do you feel in terms of things like interdisciplinary education and trying to find ways to inspire people to sort of co-create and to reach for other ideas that have never been tried, frankly? Thank you.
Well, of course, I agree with everything you said, and I think the way that I often talk about it just very simply is asking the next question and the question behind the question, the question to really encourage us to be curious, right, and follow our curiosity. Because if you're curious, then certainly in my case, and I think anybody who's ever gotten curious about one specific thing, to really go deeply and to understand it, you have to touch so many other disciplines. And so I think really encouraging curiosity from the earliest ages and the willingness to ask and to make stabs at a hypothesis, even if you're way off, that exploratory learning is the key. Active learning is the key. Is at least it's been what's kept me alive. I feel like the greatest gift that my parents ever gave me was this curiosity, the idea that you could, whatever you wanted to learn, you could learn. And so I'm just totally with you, and really encourage that. I think, when you said how do we get others to think, I think what I'm so concerned about, because people think of me as a lefty or a progressive, and so I'm very aware of so many progressives that still fall so easily into, it's the bad guys, it's them, and not taking it's not taking a systems view of our situation. And so I think challenging people that that we agree with on so many things, but challenging when they fall into that idea that, oh, it's the it's the bad it's the bad right winger who's doing all of this, right? Rather than seeing a systems problem and system solution.
So thank you for coming and talking. I'm actually in an environmental studies class, and we're using the Capra textbook that you mentioned.
Oh,
the
you are?
Systems
Oh,
Theory of
great.
Life, yeah.
Yeah.
And we also just read a book by Lester Brown.
Uh-huh.
And in it, he talks about how he thinks the 4 big things to turn things around are changing what we think of as security and turning it more to food security, helping solve the problems with soil erosion, water productivity, and there's one more, but I forget what it is. But he suggests that to do this, we need to do all 4 of them at the same time. And I'm just wondering if you agree with that, or if you think there's a different approach that could help solve these issues.
Well, I think I would agree. I mean, I know we quote Lester Brown talking about the need for grain reserves, for example. That's just such a no doubt, you know, that we have stocks of what we haven't organized because of the thinness of our democracies to create reserves that would prevent that kind of horror that happened in 07, 08 when the food prices shot up and people died in the streets from rioting over food. I mean, so I would agree with, I haven't, is it a new book or the Lester Brown book? Yeah, I haven't read it, but I would agree. It's the only place I differ from Lester Brown that I've been very strongly aware of over the years is that he uses the language of scarcity when I think that's very confusing in a world that has this abundance that we're describing now. But I think those points are really good ones.
I really do believe in the importance of the rural smallholder farmer in solving these problems, but being that climate change affects disproportionately the global south where a lot of them are based, I think that it's something that people haven't quite, I guess, satisfyingly answered the question of what do we do to support these farmers when the job that they do that's so important really leaves them at such a disadvantage and such a vulnerability. And just
yes, thank you. Yeah, a question about small farmers and the threat of climate change and vulnerability. I mean, the chapter in our new book that took me the more time than anything was the climate change, exactly the questions you're asking, climate change and how does that connect with hunger and small farm production. And the good news is that exactly the kinds of approaches, say, that the women in Andhra Pradesh are using are those that make them more resilient because they're less water dependent. Using these practices of composting, mulching, of keeping crops, keeping the land covered, of integrating trees that lower the ground temperature. All these things help farmers become more resilient to climate change. And so it's exactly these practices that are more and more needed. And when I was out in the fields with the women in Andhra Pradesh, I said, aren't you worried about climate change? And they said, no, actually, we know what to do. We know which seeds to use when the rains don't come. And so they're building that awareness and working very much to know how to respond. Whereas the system that I started out with, I mean, the water intensity use we calculated that we could bathe for, anyone could bathe for well over a month for the amount of water used, with the amount of water used to produce just 1 pound of beef in the industrial system. So, it's the industrial system that's incredibly water wasteful. And it's a small agroecological farmer that is the water saving and that is working with a range of seeds that respond in different climatic circumstances. And so that's, and that keeping the soil covered in also is good in terms of mitigating carbon release from the soil that worsens climate change. And so in all those ways, all of these practices that I was alluding to are very very, very important as we face climate change. Yes, please, Varun.
I just wanted to say that I reading the manuscript of the book. As you said, also
Varun has
in
worked
the
in our
book,
office.
most of the agricultural production is not done by large corporations or organizations, but the majority of food is produced by small farmers. So, in the sense of having small farms and a multitude of crops that you can generate in a small farm even is very, very helpful because still you are supplying that products. You consume it locally, and so it's not being transported far away, and so you increase the resilience of the farmer, him or herself, but also the community. So it is very important to keep that in mind because we still believe, or we believe that the food is produced by a handful of
Right, exactly. Thank you, because I should have said that we've just been looking into those numbers even more in the last week, but the best that we can come to is that in sub-Saharan Africa and all of Asia, which represent about 73% of the world's population, 80% of the food is grown, is grown there in those regions. So that's very, very significant what you're saying. And yet, in terms of support, as one of you asked, often the problem is just the most basic things like storage, so it's worth it to harvest because you have storage to put your harvest in and keep it. That is what's often missing. Or simple drying. We have a statistic about West African fruit rotting because they're not simple solar dryers that are very low cost that would allow people to dry the fruit and store it. So some of this is very low cost support in terms of helping with even a very, very low interest loan to get solid storage could help hugely in terms of reducing hunger and making people more resilient to climate change. Oh, sorry.
I wanted to ask what you see is the impact for the whole rural to urban migration, especially like in Asia, because as you talked about so many subsistence farming, and I think a lot of these people are actually not the ones suffering from hunger, but like the people living in slums all over these big cities. And we saw in the last years that they have been growing like crazy. And these people don't necessarily have the chance to have their own land or to farm, to plant anything. And most of them came from subsistence farming and went then to the big cities looking for a new chance.
Right.
What do you see as the impact of it?
Well, I think I would just want to start by saying that I think there's somewhat of a frame that people would prefer to go to the city and look for a job there. But from all that we've read and some studies that seem pretty sound, that actually when people can make a decent living, they want to stay in their communities where they have roots and farm in a way that would allow them to stay there. So that the challenge is making it viable for people to stay in their communities, number one. And then in urban areas, I was just reading about very simple process in the largest slum in Kenya, in Nairobi, the Kibera, and people are moving toward growing, and we saw this even 2000 we were there, people growing food, substantial amount in gunny sacks with holes in the sides, sort of vertical gardens, and producing quite a bit of their own food that way. And they are saying that this is really helping them with their family's hunger. So, but I do think that the most important that we drop the idea that anybody who could would move to the city, when in fact it's because people aren't able to make a living because they're not getting a fair price for what they produce, and they've been encouraged to shift to chemical inputs which cost so much, and the prices are so unstable. In one very short period, for example, a few years ago, the price of chemical fertilizers tripled in a relatively short period of time. And so then farmers are just in a desperate situation if they've shifted their whole operation to reliance on purchased inputs. And so that is really the challenge, is spreading this kind of knowledge that the Deccan Development Society women represent to me, but it's a much, much broader movement there. And in the state of Kerala is moving to 100% organic. That's their goal over the next 10 years, so that their farmers won't be so vulnerable to these various price increases, and so they can stay on their land and build cooperatives that keep more of the profits that in their communities and free them from dependence on the money lenders. So I think that's really the place that is, that shift to what does it take to enable people to stay in their communities is the important question. These are all great questions. Thank you.
I have a question also. Mine was in a similar vein of carrying a lot of these ideas into urban environments, and what might that really look like specifically. I'm wondering about the need to create cohesive communities of mutual accountability and connection and that kind of thing within these environments like New York that are where everybody's so drained for time, and, and the communities themselves are incredibly porous. Do you have any insights or tips for creating cohesive communities in an environment like this?
Well, probably people here would have more ideas than I do. I was just a small thing. I was struck. We were looking at initiatives about reducing food waste, that were bringing people together in some of the urban centers, like in Germany and England, are examples. And there was, an example of how people were creating together places where people could bring their leftovers and just things they'd bought too much of, and just make it freely available. That kind of connection over making healthy food available, I thought was really a great example. But probably here there are people who are a lot more knowledgeable than I. Yes, please.
So this was sort of spurred by your question about your conference in Geneva. I've been reading a lot of bell hooks lately, and I feel like in some ways the conversation that you're having about food relates to the conversation she's having about race. And addressing race in this country is extraordinarily fraught, and it's like this thing where we're like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. It's just so big. And bell hooks was like, well, actually, if you just like look people in the eye when you pass them, like you just see that they're a human, and if they're behind you, you just hold the door for them, and I don't know, if they do it for you, just like say thank you, stuff like that. That really goes far in this building of community. And so I was like, well, I can try that. And so I've been doing that all the time for about a year. I live in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and it's the first time I've ever lived in a predominantly black neighborhood in my life. And I have to say that the enormous shift in people's faces when I actually look into their eyes, I don't talk to them. I mean, maybe I say good morning. It's not like I'm like, oh, hey, what are you doing? What's going on today? Like, I just see that they're human and smile, or not, just have that exchange. And that exchange is extraordinarily powerful. And it has created a very strong community for me. And it's only been 1 year. I know almost all of my neighbors, not extraordinarily deeply or well, but I mean, it actually works, and it's really doable. It takes no extra time at all in my day, and actually I'm uplifted by it regularly. So I would recommend seeing the humans near you in their eyes, and and just, I mean, we're animals. Like, if I'm there whether you look at me or not, so you might as well just look at me, because
right.
it's
I
better.
Totally
it has
with
potential. Except, it doesn't hurt. Like not noticing me does. And it's far-reaching, I think, in the same way that you're asking.
Yeah. Thank you. And I should also mention that some of interested in this urban question is that there are remarkable examples that now have spread into maybe 5 or 6 states from one start in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, called Growing Power, which became a community empowerment through food that is quite extraordinary. And Growing Power is the name of it. And also I highly recommend a book called The Stop, which written by a Canadian who took, and I visited this place, it's remarkable, it's a bus terminal that they turned into a community center slash garden and cooking areas, so that all generations and all the different ethnic groups come together in this community space. So there are powerful examples. Those are just two. There's something called Growing Home, which in Chicago that works with people coming out of incarceration and uses community gardens to teach food skills for ultimately, and get training in restaurants and that sort of thing, called Growing Home. So there are, in so many different cities, there are powerful examples of this, take this really meeting each other eye to eye and coming up with very creative ideas around directly engaging people in food production and distribution.
Hi, I was just at NYU's first Sustainability Summit last Saturday, and I went to a workshop on this new concept called freeganism, which is, I don't know, it's when they're basically the idea that like a lot of supermarkets dispose of a lot of really good food, just because of the income of new produce and the rules about expiration dates, etc. And so there are groups of people who get together and go to these different locations and basically open up these like treasure troves of garbage. They call it trash rescue of this food. And I found this really interesting, but then it kind of seemed like there was something missing in the process, that like maybe some of the people who are finding this food don't necessarily need to be finding free food, and that there could be systems in which this like mass this abundance of food could be, especially in a city, in an urban setting, where this is like easily like 2 feet away from a homeless person on the street. So how do we connect this like very obvious kind of like in front of our faces thing to the greater setting, and kind of your thoughts on that concept?
Well, I don't know enough about it to say anything very useful, but I really encourage you to look at what Germany is doing, and we talk about it in our book, and I'm forgetting the term they use, but there's a website, and that exactly a more organized version, but very much motivated by the same sense, and throughout, especially I think in Berlin. So it might be interesting to see what they're doing. Also in France, there's something called the Ugly Fruit movement, where they encouraged grocery stores to put a 30% discount on fruit that is slightly imperfect. And people love it, and so the waste has been significantly reduced just by that alone, One of the things I learned in writing the book was that, at least in some factories, that they have the sensor that they will toss a carrot out if it's just slightly crooked. This is very extreme. And this kind of ugly fruit or ugly produce movement could help to reorient us away from the perfectly straight carrot. So I think, I would, and if you can't find it, our info@smallplanet.org, you could email us and we could get you that link that we found. Oh, speaking of Small Planet, I did circulate a sign up. My daughter and I have a quarterly e-letter, and we don't bombard you, but we let you know what we're up to, and my daughter does a lot of work in video and that sort of thing. So I think we'd love to put you on our list if you wanted to sign. It's back there now. So I love these questions, and this is my first talk since I pushed the button, as I said, and so you can tell I'm a little bit breathless coming out of all this new learning, that I wanted to tell you everything I've learned for the last 50 years. But anyway, thank you for your forbearance and hanging in there with me, and your great questions. And my son just lives a couple blocks from here, so I hope to have more. I get here often and hope to have more of a connection with you. And thank you so much, Apollo, for making this possible. Thank you. Thank you.